This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. This week, a talk with Jim Zub, writer of the Image series Wayward and current writer on Marvel's Thunderbolts. Wayward takes place in Japan, and we'll talk about the... Wayward takes place here in Japan, and we'll talk about the effort that goes into accurately portraying Japan, as well as making Thunderbolts, the harsh realities of the American comics market, making yourself visible in the comics industry, and more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. Okay, I'm talking with Jim Zub, who is in the Toronto area. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Yeah, so we saw each other at Kaigai Manga Festa back in October here in Tokyo. Mm-hmm. And from reading Wayward, I gather that wasn't the first time you'd ever been here.
No, I'm that particular trip was like my seventh to Japan. I absolutely love Japan, and it's always a blast when I get a chance to visit. So I love it.
But you've never lived here.
I've never lived here. No. Steven Cummings, who draws Wayward, he lives in Yokohama.
Right.
So he's the one with the direct Japan experience.
Right. Yeah, I had met him at Kaigai once before, I think back in 2013, and I had him on the show before, too, when he was doing some work with Udon.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah, that was the second time I had met him in person this past year.
Yeah, he's great. I love working with him on the series. It's tons of fun.
Yeah, so he can bring he knows what Japan looks like, so he can draw it well.
Absolutely. Yeah, the great thing is that we work together on a lot of different aspects of it. So, I've got sort of the overplot and the character development stuff, but then he's bringing obviously all the visuals and the locations and really making Japan a viable, I want to say almost character in the story, that it feels very settled and real, with all it just creates a great base for our supernatural story and makes it feel very grounded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and having read comics that took place in Japan drawn by people who had never been here, I can tell the difference.
Yeah. Growing up, I had read the X-Men issues where they go to Japan, and you would think that every single one of them was just like a neon-soaked street,
yes,
or a ninja temple, and it was cool. It was definitely evocative, mm-hmm. but not necessarily
of any country that actually exists.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, or the one I always think of is after this, back in the 90s, after Heroes Reborn, when the heroes came back, and somehow Captain America ended up in Japan.
Weird.
And I used, on my old website, I used to have sort of a article about that, and took out panels and kind of made jokes about them because there were so many things that were just wrong.
Right. Well, and this is the thing. I think it's super important if you're going to have a location, try and make sure you do your research, for crying out loud. Make sure that, these are real places. These are places. Well, it's easier than ever now, particularly with the internet, that
mm-hmm.
you're able to actually gather this stuff, or Google Earth or whatever may have you.
Yeah, Street View would be really useful.
Yeah, Steve and I use that quite a bit, actually. In some cases, we almost cast neighborhoods where he'll tell me about particular places, and then he'll send me a Google Earth link or Google Street View, and I sort of tour around a little bit and kind of get a feel for it, so that when I'm writing, I'm not just sort of, mindlessly trying to describe somewhere that I don't, at least even have a sense of. So,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I found it interesting in Wayward that you're kind of introducing a Western audience to Japanese folklore and the yokai. Explain what those are and why you're interested in them.
Well, so the yokai are, it's a very broad kind of category of mythology, kind of creatures and spirits, right? And so they're in Europe, it would be dragons and unicorns and everything, vampires and everything sort of in between for Eurocentric kind of myths and creatures. And Japan has just an incredible variety of myths, an incredible variety of creatures and spirits and lore, really built into every aspect of their storytelling and their folklore and locations. And so it's a real fertile ground for us to be able to explore and to take some of those ideas and put them in the modern world and put them into the modern, Japan or in Tokyo in particular. Mm-hmm. And so it's been just a ton of fun, first of all, being able to take some of these things and give them a neat little modern twist, but also introduce them to North American readers and give them a little bit of insight into some Japanese history and culture, both in terms of the fictional version in our story, but also we've got these really cool essays in the back. Most of them are written, the Japanese ones are written by this guy named Zach Davison, mm-hmm. and he sort of walks readers through the actual historical context for a lot of these legends and where they've come from. And so, I don't want to say it's like educational in that sense. I mean, I think it is, but it's not really. It's entertainment is our broad goal, of course. Mm-hmm. But the fact that we can bring that knowledge into it at the same time, I think really gives it an extra flair.
Yeah, well, I was reading those essays. It was interesting to me to think about how, like, in the Edo times, people really believed that, foxes were causes of disasters and whatever, and it caused some real, sounds like, social upheaval sometimes.
Well, in the same way that in Eastern Europe, there was people were convinced of vampires and all sorts of other spirits and things. I think that it's very much of that time for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we just kind of think of them as these Halloween characters or whatever, but
or Pokemon.
Yes. I wanted to ask about your main character, Rory. Mm-hmm. So I guess her father is Irish.
Right.
And her mom is Japanese.
That's right.
Why did you decide to make her part Irish?
So it ties into some of the larger story stuff that we're developing later on. Okay. And we've touched upon it in the fourth story arc, sort of issues 15 to 20. But Ireland has an equally, kind of powerful folklore and really deep, rich,
if that was coming.
Spiritual history, and that we wanted to sort of both the similarities and the contrasts between them. We were sort of playing with those symbolically. One of the things that Zach and I have talked about, he says that islands tend to have these really amazing mythological lore because they're sort of detached from other cultures. They're able to build their stuff in isolation. And I feel like Japan and Ireland really have that kind of similarity in that sense. They've got just rich folklore and creatures and spirits and the storytelling that comes from both of those. I feel there's enough similarities there that we're able to, like I said, compare and contrast. And as the story goes on, the connection between those two and how they sort of feed into one another as part of our plot is going to become more clear. So it wasn't a random choice, let's put it that way. It was very much, it's baked into the bigger, broader story that we're developing.
Okay, so we got some leprechauns coming?
Well, see, this is the thing, right? In the same way that I think that people assume that if it's a Japanese creature, whatever, like, oh, it's a ninja or it's, whatever, people always go to leprechauns.
That's all we know, yeah.
Right. Well, but there are dozens and dozens of really cool Irish folklore creatures. And so one of the first ones we have is, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. So please, I always have to I want to get it right. Don't get me wrong, but whenever you're dealing with other cultures, you've always got to sort of head off at the pass that you may not get it perfect. So this thing called Gakana, which is basically like it's a almost like a leprechaun offshoot. So there are these really attractive kind of men that go out and pick up women, basically, but they're these spirits that use their powers to sort of entice women away from their husbands or away from their, chaste lives or whatever may have you. And so we have one of those show up in the story. And so there's a leprechaun sort of offshoot in that way, but it's a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more interesting than just basically saying, okay, it's like a little guy and, guarding a pot of gold or something. Like, the real legends are so much more interesting than just sort of the stereotype. And that's what's been a lot of fun to dig into as well. Is sort of saying, okay, let's push this a little bit further, or let's see how we can give it a slight adjustment for that modern, feel. There's this particular Japanese one called, and the name just left me. The translation I remember, it's called a filth licker, and essentially what they were is these little creatures that parents would warn their kids about. They would say, if you don't clean up after yourself in the washroom, or if you don't clean the washroom, because in the family, the kid would, if they were the lowest on the social totem pole, they would have to clean up the chamber pot or whatever the Japanese equivalent would be. And they would say this creature would come, and it's got a long tongue, and it's going to eat up all the waste, and then it's going to come eat you, kind of thing. And so I said, well, that's a really weird, creepy, evocative thing. Well, where would those go in a modern context or in a city? So we have hundreds of them in the sewers, and they're just feeding off of, filth and sewage and sort of existing beneath Tokyo. So it's like taking the real legend, but then sort of, nudging it into a place that makes sense in a modern context.
Yeah. Akaname, I just found it.
Akaname, that's right.
Okay. Yeah. So we've got Irish folklore coming as well. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's nice to be able to sort of, again, take these different elements, both these, Irish or Celtic kind of elements and Japanese ones, and sort of play with them and evolve them. And, even in Japan, they use, something like the kappa, hundreds of different permutations of that classic kind of creature. And so when we do our little spin on it, it's very much in that same kind of tradition of, building our own little mythology out of it.
Yeah, well, those are the biggest, burliest kappa I ever saw.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. And Ayane, one of the characters, she makes a joke about it. She's like, I liked you guys better when you were little cute ones with the head, It's sort of playing to their original nature, that they haven't always been this way, that maybe they have grown and changed over with the times as well.
I see. So I read volume 1, and Japan seemed pretty familiar. There was one kind of detail that felt a little bit off. So Rory has come to Japan and staying with her mother, and they're speaking Japanese, and it's English in brackets.
Right.
And at one point, her mom is supposedly saying in Japanese to her daughter, "I love you," which, I don't know, Japanese are usually not that demonstrative in families. I couldn't even quite imagine what Japanese her mom would be saying in that case.
Well, it's difficult too, because in some ways we've got to sort of thread the needle between a North American reader, while using those cultural elements of Japan. So, sometimes whether it's colloquialisms or sort of slang or things like that, we got to kind of strike the middle and sort of go, okay, well, this is the equivalent of what's being said, and sometimes I've talked to Steven, we have this conversation where he'll sort of say, they would say this much more formally in Japan. And I say, in actual Japanese. And I go, I get that. But part of the problem is because our readers are North American or English readers primarily, they'll misread that formality as very cold, or they'll misread it as very, the formality comes across quite differently to a North American reader. And so sometimes you got to sort of make a value judgment in terms of, okay, what are we trying to communicate in terms of emotion or plot, and make the best sort of compromise we can for the language barrier that we're trying to sort of, find the nuance with.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really a Japanese equivalent to an F-bomb either. I mean,
Right,
there's
exactly.
really
Right.
crude language that they
Yeah,
would probably be using in Japanese, but there are not so many particular words like in English. So,
exactly. And so that's one of those things where it's like, well, I want them to be teenagers, and I want them to talk with that nasty kind of, insulting sort of tone. And so, using the F word is something that a North American reader is going to instantly understand and get the right, just it's the proper sort of the feel that they're going to have for it.
but yeah, you got a lot of details that I'm not sure everyone, like school starting in April. I think
Right.
a lot of North American writers would probably not even think to question when school starts. Well, it starts in the fall, of course, but
Right. Well, and that was one of those things where I would, have to really do my research and talk to Steven about it and sort of go, okay, what are the differences? What are the little things, that we can, some of it, I don't want to turn it into a textbook where we're sitting there and we're pointing it out explicitly. Like, if anything, it's a character story first, and then, after that, it's about the cultural stuff. So the cultural stuff has to sort of fade into the background, but still be detail accurate.
yeah. Okay. Now you're doing Thunderbolts. I want to talk about that too, but let's kind of back up a little first. So, where did you grow up?
Whoa, we're going way back.
Yeah.
I grew up in Oshawa, which is sort of, I guess, about half an hour, 45 minutes outside of Toronto here in Canada. It's like a blue collar kind of town. We've got a General Motors, car plant was sort of like the big industry thing in town. And yeah, grew up there, and my entire sort of school life there until the end of high school.
Okay. And what comics were you reading back then?
The first comics, like, I'm sure I remember reading Spidey Super Stories
Oh
and the
yeah.
Electric Company magazine and stuff like that. But the first ones I ever collected were the G.I. Joe ones that Marvel put out in the early 80s. I was a big fan of the cartoon. I was the perfect age for it. And from there, I came in sideways to the Marvel Universe. So my brother and I started really collecting the Marvel stuff in earnest. Right around the time, I guess it was in between Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2, we started just hardcore collecting Marvel stuff. I was reading Spider-Man like crazy, and I collected Amazing Spider-Man for years and years. My brother Joe, he loved the mutant books, so he was getting X-Men and New Mutants and eventually, X-Factor and all that stuff. And then we both really loved Doctor Strange because we're big sword and sorcery fans, and he was like a wizard who's also a superhero, and we loved the mythic stuff with Thor, and we'd occasionally buy issues of Hulk or Captain America or Fantastic Four, just really all over the place, as much as we could get our hands on. Once the official handbook of the Marvel Universe came out, we were just losing our minds because it felt like this catalog, like they had it all figured out, like everything was planned, and it was so codified and organized. And we were just, again, at that perfect age. It's like kids that are into Pokemon or something now, you can memorize them all and understand the stats, and like, that when you're at that age where you just become obsessed with something. And that was us with the Marvel Universe. We wanted to read it all. We wanted to have it all. Like, my brother had a checklist. He wanted to buy like first appearances of characters and villains, and just fill in all the gaps as much as we could with our limited budget. And we just read it and obsessed over it.
I see. Did you make any comics back then?
I did. Like, I would do these little dorky, my own little G.I. Joe comics and Spider-Man comics and stuff like that. At first, literally drawn with stick figures, and then eventually done with a little more, artistic flair as we sort of went through. It's funny because my parents surprisingly kept all of those. And I don't know that they cared about the actual comics, but they thought it was super cute that I was drawing and making them. And so when I bought my own house here in Toronto and they dropped off boxes and boxes of all my old things, in there were some of my old original comics. And so, real nostalgic overload to see some of those and, remember obsessing over making these things and trying to find the right pencil crayons to get the right colors of all the superheroes,
I see.
Yeah.
So at what point did you start thinking that you might want to write or draw comics for a career?
Well, it was sort of interesting. That was another thing that I never thought would be a possibility. In high school, I made the decision to go into animation, both because I loved animation and the animated art form, but also because there was an art college west of Toronto that had a really highly regarded animation program, and a bunch of the graduates had gone on to work at Disney or work in television. And so to me, it was like, well, that was a viable career path. As far as I could tell growing up, making comics meant you either had to live in New York City or you had to be a brilliant British guy. And so I was like, well, I'm neither of those things. And so comics are not something that I'll be able to do. But animation, there's dozens and dozens of names on the credits of each of these animated films and TV shows I like. And I could be one of those people quickly scrolling by in the credits.
Never mind.
Yeah, that felt very achievable. You know what I mean? Like, I could be one of those schmoes. I could see myself there. And so that was really my original goal, was to be an animator. And that's what I went to school for and ultimately got my training in and did work in. So I'd done work in a bunch of different, Canadian cartoons, some of which might air in the U.S., but a bunch probably didn't. And really cut my teeth on all that stuff. But what it taught me a lot about was, drawing and drawing quickly, drawing expressively and storytelling. And, a lot of animators make comics and a lot of comic book people, get into animation. So there's quite a bit of crossover there. So I was doing that for several years. But then one of the places I was working at, it was not very creatively fulfilling. It really was kind of a cog in the machine. And so while I was working there, I started kind of pining to want to do my own project. And in that time, I had been seeing quite a few comics starting to pop up online. This is the late 90s, just as the internet's finally starting to take hold. And so most of them were like comic strippy kind of, nerd fare, but in a Garfield kind of mode or whatever, the original, penny arcade strips or Player versus Player. I don't know if you've read either of those, but they're long running web comics and stuff like that. But they were just starting off, and it just seemed like I didn't know how to get a book printed or how to get a book into stores, but I was like, I could bash together basic HTML and make a website and throw these up on a website. And so I started doing my own webcomic in 2001 and started posting it online. I would post 3 pages a week, and I didn't know if anyone was going to read it. I was just doing it sort of as an outlet for myself. But it was a dramatic story rather than a comedic one. And so I think it sort of stood out a little bit to some people because they were like, oh, I haven't seen as much of this in that online space. Someone doing a story that's going to have a distinct beginning, middle, and an end. It's not just a gag a week kind of thing or a gag a strip, kind of thing. And so it was a way I, sort of taught myself the sequential storytelling form and, what worked and what didn't. And I was I knew some Photoshop, but I was sort of teaching myself some of those things as well because they didn't cover a lot of that in school. And so it was just a real, it was a fun period because I could just experiment and learn as I went along. And because most of the people doing online comic strips were just doing very cartoony stuff, I was able to just sort of kind of find my own little niche and build on it and learn along the way. And so I did that for a little while. And
So what was that comic called that you were
it's called
working
The Makeshift Miracle.
on? Oh, okay. Yeah. I think I listened back to our interview at Kaigai, and you think you had some, like a paperback of that on your
Right.
table that I asked about.
Yeah, and so it was this really great learning experience for me, and a way to build up my confidence and finish something, that I created, and learn how comics sort of function. And it definitely gave me a taste for it and a sense of, okay, I want to be, a creator. I want to tell stories. I don't just want to tell other people's stories. And even still, I didn't necessarily have the confidence that I was going to make this an ongoing career. When I had moved around a little bit for animation work. When I moved back to Toronto, the industry for hand-drawn 2D animation had really fallen apart. And so I was looking at going back to school for 3D animation training. It wasn't even something I necessarily wanted to do, but it's like, well, that's where all the jobs are. So I guess I got to go get this training. And that summer, before I went back to school, I lucked out that a friend of mine was working at a studio called Udon. And they had a real, anime flair to their artwork. And they had quite a few artists that were heavily influenced by Japanese anime and manga. And I had really loved that stuff in high school. That's sort of a little sideline. My brother, he went to the University of Waterloo here in Ontario, and in their programming and engineering programs, which were very highly regarded, they had a lot of Japanese international students, and those guys had brought their manga and their anime with them and kind of got everyone hooked. And so Waterloo was one of the early kind of hotbeds of anime fandom in the mid 90s, early 90s even, actually, now that I think about it. So, as Akira, was really erupting in North America, they had already had it for a couple years. And
Been there, done that.
yeah, the first time I saw Akira was off of a Japanese Laserdisc with a Japanese person basically telling us what people were saying in real time. Like, it was this weird sort of thing, and I remember watching the OVA for Black Magic M66 and Bubblegum Crisis and all this sort of stuff, and most of them just in Japanese, and really being amazed at what the cartoons were doing and what the comics were capable of, and all that sort of stuff. And so the Udon studio had a bunch of these amazing artists who were influenced by the same kind of stuff that I loved. And I found a place for myself there. And so instead of going back to school for 3D animation, I ended up staying at the Udon studio for years, starting off as a colorist and then working over into illustration and then moving over into more of a management position and helping organize art teams for projects and interfacing with clients and all sorts of stuff like that. And what that gave me was a real under the hood look at the industry as a whole, how publishing works, how commercial art and illustration work, meeting a schedule, hitting a deadline, making to spec. And so it just gave me this crash course in comics and illustration and freelance art that really helped empower me later on when I sort of went back to start making my own stories again. And so then when I started doing my own comics again in 2009, 2010, it was this with so much more knowledge, behind it, how things work, how to get stuff done, what a publisher or printer is looking for. And so I was able to sort of get some traction and also be able to deliver what an editor or a publisher wanted to see, because I knew on the other end what we wanted when we were working, with these clients. And so very quickly, when I started digging into it and started writing, I had the advantage of sort of saying, okay, I've been an editor on a book. I've been, on the other side of this thing. I know what you need to see, or I know what you need in order to make your job easier. That's the big secret to almost anyone in any industry. If you can make someone else's life, particularly your supervisor, a lot easier, they're going to like you. They're going to want to hire you and continue to hire you. And so, I feel like a lot of the writing success, in addition to, hopefully good, compelling stories and engaging characters, is being on time and being well organized and communicating well in a way that I would want if I was the editor,
So now you're basically writing these days, but you were drawing it you drew your webcomic by yourself, I assume.
So I drew, I was doing art for quite a long time. I did a lot of illustration, commercial illustration, and I did what was called layout and design in animation. So that's background drawing. So I was drawing the backgrounds that would go to the background painters and sort of solidifying what had been initially worked out in the storyboard stage. I was doing like the tight environmental drawings and stuff like that for animation. So that was sort of my, my training and what I was doing on an art level. And that's another really useful thing, is that when I'm working with an artist, like I know if this can be drawn, like I'm not writing something that can't be done, or I'm not, packing a panel with too much information that they're not going to be able to actually put it there. Or we can, when we get the roughs in, I can speak pretty, clearly about what's working, or if we need to make changes, because I've been on the other end of it, or I've been an art director and stuff like that. So it's nice to have those sort of skills up and down the pipeline to sort of know what other people need in order to do their jobs.
Now, you're working with a number of artists these days. Steve Cummings on Wayward, and John Malin, is that his pronunciation?
Yeah, John Malin does
Thunderbolts.
The Thunderbolts book primarily, yeah.
So, what are the differences between working with John and working with Steve? Do you write differently and to work to their strengths, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every project that I do, there's times when you have to write a script for a commercial project and you don't know who the artist is going to be, so you have to be pretty all around descriptive, because you're like, I don't know who's picking this up. But if I know who the artist is and I can get a feel for what their strengths are, what they like to draw, what they're good at drawing, I want to lean into that. I want them to have fun doing it, and I want the best quality product on the other end as well. So Steve and I have a very different relationship because it's our book and we co-own it. Image doesn't have editors in that sense of like someone telling us what to do. They're really unique when it comes to the publishing end of things. They were formed by creators for creators, and they're all about empowering creators to be able to make what they want, including making mistakes if you aren't organized or you don't get stuff done on time or whatever. But thankfully, we've got a good production schedule, and we've both been, doing this for quite a while. So it's something where we kind of know our own productivity and can work to that. So yeah, Steve's working with Steve's very different. With John, we've got an editor, and we're dealing with Marvel properties and characters. So obviously there's a lot more of a vetting process in terms of the stories and approvals and all that kind of stuff. And with Steve and I, it's much more spontaneous. We don't, we plan it out, but if we come up with a cool idea, I don't have to worry about getting approval. We just sort of dive into it.
Coming up, taking over the Thunderbolts, becoming visible within the comics industry, the issues versus trade paperbacks dichotomy, and more. But first, help Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Poles move up to bigger and better things. Pledge a few bucks a month via Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And by the way, I haven't been doing bonus content on Patreon lately, in part because I'm not sure what you're interested in. What could I make available as bonus content that would make becoming our patron more attractive? Let me know and I'll try to make it a reality. Mail at deconstructingcomics.com.
Hi, my name is Billy Hogan, host of the Superman Fan Podcast, which explores the world of Superman and the many creators who have added to his legacy over the decades. Episodes will feature creator biographies or highlight some of their top stories they have created as well as their top characters. Other episodes will feature topics appropriate to the holiday or the time of the year. For instance, Valentine's Day will feature stories about the women in Superman's life. April Fool's Day will feature some of the bizarre Superman Silver Age stories, or some of the imaginary stories that have been published. Halloween will feature some of the scary Superman stories, or some of his strange transformations, and of course, some of the Christmas Superman stories. The website can be found at supermanfanpodcast.mypodcast.com. The blog is supermanfanpodcast.blogspot.com, and you can send email to supermanfanpodcast@gmail.com. I also have a spoiler-free comic book review blog of the titles I read every week, which can be found at mypulllist.blogspot.com, and you can send email about this blog to mypulllist@gmail.com.
So it must be fun to work with the real original Thunderbolts characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the Marvel characters it's an absolute blast. Sometimes it's downright surreal working on this stuff that, like I grew up reading a bunch of these things.
Mm-hmm.
First time you write one of these iconic characters and you start putting literally words in their mouth, and you're just like, oh yeah, I guess that's what Captain America is saying. It's just it's fascinating. And you almost feel like there's a moment when you do the first time where you just expect the editor to come back and go, you don't know what you're doing. This is crazy. You can't do that.
Cap would never say that.
Yeah, Cap would never say that. He's my pal or whatever. I was like, but you just realize, oh no, these books are made by people, and we're gonna, come up with the scenarios and generate the dialogue and create the drama. And really, it's been a really cool experience. I love doing both. I love having creator-owned books where I've got just complete kind of unfettered control to make something from scratch. But I also have, these commercial projects that are recognizable, and they're a good way, for me to raise my profile, but also they're a lot of fun. And I get to really kind of flex those creative muscles in unexpected ways as I'm trying to come up with new stories for characters that have been around so long.
Yeah, well, that must be difficult. I was going to ask about that. How do you find new things for them to do?
Well, I'm pretty research crazy. Like, I know some writers who just sort of dive in and go, well, I'm doing this, and they don't really care if it's been done that way before. I tend to want to read as much material from those characters as I can, so I can compare and contrast and sort of go, okay, this has happened to the character before. Is there a way to do a new twist on that? Or what's the logical sort of progression of their needs or their wants or their, emotional state or whatever you want to call it? Where can we take them from here that they haven't been before but feels logical, in the overall scope of the character? It is a big ongoing sort of soap opera. So you sort of try and find permutations on that, or you sort of say, okay, any story is about, ideas or characters that have beliefs, and then you test those beliefs. You test their resolve. You test their commitment to what they believe in, and that's where you generate conflict. And so it's looking and saying, first of all, what do I think this character believes in, or what is at the core of their personality or their goals? And then you're like, how do I test that? How do I strengthen that or make them doubt it in a way that's going to be interesting to the reader?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the research definitely shows. I mean, just, they'll make comments about things that happened, back in the series, like, oh yeah, when Norman Osborn was their boss. Oh yeah,
right. Yeah, and I think that's it's important. So continuity is this weird thing, and some people absolutely hate it, and some people swear by it, like it's the only thing they want. They don't even seem to care if the stories are good or bad, just as long as you acknowledge them all. And it's like, okay, there's a balance somewhere in between those two extremes. But for me, all the stories, they happened. I'm not going to pretend they didn't, but you decide which ones you emphasize and which ones you just sort of, they're not important right now, or that's not what we're focused on in the grand scheme of things. And so stuff like that, where appropriate, I want to reference it, but never make it so obtuse that a reader is feeling like, oh, if I didn't read that, I don't know what the heck's going on. Like, I always want it to feel like, oh, okay. I mean, maybe you know who Norman Osborn is, maybe you don't, but clearly he was a jerk. Mm-hmm. Like him. Great. Okay. Good.
Yeah, that was pretty clear from the exchange, even if you didn't read those stories, I think.
Exactly. And if you did read them, you're like, oh, cool. There's that feeling of continuation, of continuity, that this has happened, that these characters have existed through these adventures and are continuing to grow and change.
Oh, and I was really happy to see Jolt back. I had kind of forgotten where she was. Like, oh yeah, Counter Earth.
Well, trust that no matter what happens, Kurt Busiek will know what happened to a character. King of continuity. And my editor at Marvel is Tom Brevoort, and he's the other captain of continuity. That guy remembers everything about everything. And so it's fun though, because you want to hit those marks and make sure that you're getting it right. But at the same time, it can be kind of funny because you start talking about the stuff and it's like a rabbit hole you just get pulled into. Oh my gosh. So then this happened and this happened. You're like, okay, how can we use all this crazy material and make it, accessible? It is like constantly building this neat puzzle and finding new bits you haven't revealed before.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. It is definitely soap opera. I mean, I used to watch General Hospital back mostly in the '80s, early '90s, and there are some similarities. People die and come back to life in both.
Well, and this is one of those things where you want to simultaneously be like, you want to address some of this stuff, but you don't want to spend so much time on it that it's sort of stuck up its own butt, constantly referencing everything. You're like, okay, we have to move the ball forward. Like, we can't just navel gaze stuff that has happened before, So as much as possible, it's like, okay, yes, all that happened, and now we're going this way,
Yeah, I just have to keep up more, doing more crazy stuff, I guess.
Yeah, ever forward, right? And sure, like a soap opera, if you actually listed out all the things that happened to this character, it seems insane. You're like, and then they went here, and then they went there, and then they, how many Spider-Man stories are there? How many times do they, fight these villains? But it's like, okay, I don't need to have a running count in the book, but you get a sense of this is a long-running villain. They have interacted many times before, and this time it's going to be like this,
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's interesting to. I mean, about the time that Marvel got rid of the Comics Code, it's been over 10 years, like 10, 15 years ago now. But you started to see kind of a different. It doesn't have nothing to do with the Comics Code, but a different kind of approach where the opening of a story would be Spider-Man fighting the Rhino and beating him, and that wasn't even the main story. It was just sort of the gag at the beginning. You'd never seen a battle played that way before. So
it had a very James Bondian kind of feel, where you open in the middle of another mission, just to give you a sense of this is what the character's all about. Okay, and scene. All right, now we're going to show you what the latest problem is.
So you haven't drawn anything recently? Are you going to be drawing again at some point?
I'm not drawing any comics. So I when I'm not writing comics, I teach at an art college here in Toronto, hilariously in their animation program. And so I teach perspective drawing and I teach background drawing, all the stuff that I was trained to do. So I do keep up with quite a bit of drawing, but it's more tutorial kind of based rather than, constant illustrative. It throws people off because I'll be at a convention and people will come over and they'll be like, oh, I thought you were a writer. And I'm like, I am. Why are you drawing? Like, it's like I'm not allowed to or something. But kind of throws.
You have to do one or the other.
Yeah.
You can't do both.
You can't do both. Don't be, or the opposite. They're like, why aren't you drawing comics? And I'm like, oh, I ain't got time for that. Like I can be much more prolific as a writer than I could as an artist.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can get a lot more done, I suppose. I mean, you're writing how many series now?
Well, that's the thing, right? So I've got Wayward and another Image book called Glitter Bomb that I'm doing for Image, and then I'm doing
The Thunderbolts
and Dungeons and Dragons, which is another property that I absolutely love to pieces. And then it's just been announced I'm taking over the Uncanny Avengers, which starts in June, but I'm already working in earnest on those issues as well. So, sort of 5 books a month, depending on how you measure it.
Yeah, wow.
Whereas an artist is generally, they're going to draw 1 or less, per month. So.
Yeah, but because it takes longer to draw, I assume that the artist must get paid more per page than the writer.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the same with Steven and I as well. So, he's working on Wayward full time essentially. And so that's his full-time job. So he's getting more of the money for that. whereas I'm able to do multiple projects in addition to Wayward. And so there's sort of a proportionate kind of income there.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you mentioned at Kaigai that you used to work on the Samurai Jack comic book?
Yeah, so the Samurai Jack comic series was an official continuation of the Cartoon Network show.
Was that a DC book?
No, the DC did do a couple issues back when the original series aired, but they were pretty much just adaptations of episodes, as far as I know. Whereas our stuff was brand new stories. Just a few years ago, we did them like 3 years ago. And so this was before, they knew they were going to do a season 5. And so we were able to generate essentially sort of like an official continuation, like our own sort of season 5 with new stories of Jack and the characters sort of, new adventures that they were on. And that was a ton of fun to work on. And the artist on most of those issues was a guy named Andy Suriano, and he was one of the designers of the show. So it was this amazing thing where we would generate all sorts of crazy new ideas, and then it would look just like the show because he would draw it, so it just felt like we were just having this ball coming up with all new Samurai Jack stuff, and the fans really responded well to it, and we had a ton of fun. We ended up doing 20 issues in total from what was originally supposed to be a 5-issue miniseries.
And who was publishing that?
That was IDW, the same guys that
okay.
published the Dungeons and Dragons books, actually.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Samurai Jack is kind of. I've seen the series somewhat on TV, but it's kind of Japanese and it's kind of Chinese. And I'm not sure what it is.
It's very much this sort of genre melting pot. It's like taking all these kind of cultural isms and pop culture sort of elements of those classic sort of wandering warrior stories, but also it's got these weird sort of asides that feel a bit like a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, and it's got weird humor, and some of them are philosophical. Like, it's really all over the place, and yet it seems to all hold together in a really cool way. It's very confident in itself, even when it's sort of taking these disparate thematic ideas and jamming them all together.
So on your site, it was a little hard to find. It's like in the footer of every page, you've got these links to articles that you've written that were like kind of tutorial things or talking about the comics industry.
Yeah.
And I read a few of those. There was one from a few years back where you were talking about a pitch that you received. And it sounded a lot like, Mulele and I do this spin-off podcast critiquing comics where the listeners send us their comics to critique. But a lot of, it seemed what you were writing there was kind of similar to, it sounded like a lot of the comics we get where it's kind of, it's okay, but there's so much that could, it's so kind of typical.
Generic, yeah.
Yes. And it just kind of reminds me, seeing that somebody else is saying the same things we are. There's, in any kind of art form, there's so much being produced that's just kind of average or repetitive or typical, and it's mediocre, and it's hard to do something that's really going to stand out.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's really difficult now in the modern era, in the digital era, is that not only are you competing with all the new products coming out every single week, but the archives are so much deeper and more complete than ever before. If you don't feel like watching new television, you can watch thousands of shows archives. You want to watch all of Friends, you want to watch, Murphy Brown, or just anything. You can watch anything, hundreds of hours of content if you don't want to watch the new stuff, And the same thing with comics. Oh, you don't like the new comics coming out? Just read old Marvel comics till your head falls off. Like, you can read, all the stuff that I grew up on. I could read those endlessly and never run out of
Steve Ditko,
any of it. And you wouldn't run out of content because there's so much of it. And so you got to compete with all that too. That's the scary part, is that, making a new book means it has to be worthy versus all the comics, at people's fingertips, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a scary proposition, and so then if someone's delivering something that just feels like something I've seen a dozen times before, or feels like a knockoff of something that someone else has done better, well, I could just go read the original. Why do I need, that one of the ones I get is I get a lot of people that they want to do like a cyberpunky kind of story. They want to do Blade Runner, essentially. They're like, oh, Blade Runner is great. It's like, yeah, and Blade Runner exists and we can watch it. Why is your, vague neon drenched cyberpunk thing any more interesting than anyone else's? Like, what does it have to say that hasn't been done? Not to say that every story has to be the most innovative thing ever, but even just a little bit of a twist or a little bit of a story, something that we haven't quite seen before to justify its existence.
There was another one about, the question everyone asks, how do I break into the industry? Sure. And one of the things you mentioned there is getting socially involved in the industry, and like going to conventions and talking to the publishers and whatever. And it kind of reminds me of a problem that I sort of face in promoting my podcast, of kind of getting socially involved in the industry. And how do you do that? I mean, I'm a little bit far from the American comics industry over here.
Yeah.
But even if in the cases where I've gone to a stateside convention, like, how do you get socially involved without seeming kind of ingratiating, or kind of getting in the way? Or I kind of feel self-conscious about it sometimes.
Sure. And, there's no one size kind of fits all solution. Like for me, the advantage that I had was that I was going to conventions through the Udon studio. And so at first you're just another person wandering around, and then the same people start to see you time and time again, and that familiarity just can't help but sort of grow. And if you're not a jerk, and if you don't, show yourself badly, then you can build, a reputation, or you can just sort of get those unexpected little interactions. And rather than going to a social event and being like, oh, I'm going to find the most powerful person in the room and impress upon them how wonderful I am. It's like, well, that's not going to happen. You're just like, you know what you should do instead? Talk to the people next to you. Talk to the other people who are quietly sort of chilling at this party, and you'd be shocked at who's there. Oh, it's this colorist, this letterer, this editor, this assistant, this, this, spouse of the actual person I wanted to talk to. And then we have a great conversation, and then they end up introducing me to that person anyways. It's not going in with a hard fixed agenda of I must meet so-and-so and they must be my friend at the end of the weekend, because that is where you get the creepiness, or that is where you get the awkwardness. Yeah. If you're just like, I am here to have social experiences, and that's true of online too. I'll tweet at people, or I'll interact with people, and trying very hard not to set myself up for a particular goal. Like, I'm not talking to this person because I need them to like me and give me a job. Like, if I compliment an artist on their work, I'm complimenting them on their work, and that's it. You know what I mean? And maybe over time we end up having more conversations, and maybe over time we end up talking about my writing, or they find out that I'm a writer, and then they, I let them know that I can send them a PDF of my stuff if they ever want to see it. But I'm not like trying to hard sell every moment, every interaction.
Yeah, I suppose for me, I could use Twitter as a substitute for going to a convention. I haven't been on Twitter very much, but not as much as I maybe should be for this.
Well, and it's about having conversations rather than having agendas, right? It's not about, I'm going to go here and I'm going to make this person like me. It's like, oh, this is an engaging conversation. I will either listen, or if I genuinely have something I think I can add to the discussion, then I will. I see people all the time, they just jam themselves into a discussion because they clearly want to be a part of things. And you're like, imagine you're at a cocktail party and you're having a nice conversation with someone, and then some random other person jams their head in and goes, you know what I think? And you're just like, oh God, what are you doing? That's the sort of social media equivalent of what's going on. Whereas if you're able to sort of parse it in a way of like going, oh my, this is really interesting what you guys are talking about. I've had this experience, and it relates to what you're talking about. And if they respond favorably, you're like, oh, okay, well then I'll keep the discussion going. And if it doesn't, you just just bow out and be on your way. Don't worry that every interaction is going to be your only chance to ever meet or interact with said person,
Yeah, okay. And I read one other that was about profitability. This is one from last year.
Yeah.
And you show kind of these bar graphs on
pie charts and bar graphs.
Yeah. The sales of Wayward. You don't have any numbers along the y-axis, but it just of shows. The first issue went this high, and then in comparison, the second issue only went this high.
Right.
And the drop off is kind of scary.
Well, that's the North American comic market in a nutshell. And it's one of those things that I think people don't understand is they just sort of look and they go, oh, you're published, therefore you must be making money and so on and so forth. And you're like, well, some people make money, and we do make money on Wayward, but it's not as simple as just, put it on the shelf and the dump truck of money shows up, and the North American comic market is really competitive, and it's really saturated with product. And so the initial launch, a lot of people will sample a series to see if they like it. And if they do, what they tend to do is become trade buyers, where they'll buy it in collection. In Japan, they're buying it in what
does they say? Tankobon?
Tankobon, yeah. So, those collected editions are similar sort of theory in North America, where they're buying the trade paperbacks, and that's their sort of preferred format. And so even though we've had a drop off on our monthly issues, that if you look in the grand scheme of things, you go, oh, that seems quite severe. What it's done, though, is it's created this sampling audience that now is reading it in collections every 5 issues, And that's fine, too. It means it's a little bit scarier in the sense that the economics of it, you're waiting longer to get that payout, for lack of a better term, or to get that payoff for a reading audience. But if they're loyal and they're there and they're telling their friends about it, that audience also grows. And so, that's the long tail market, as they call it. That's sort of those books are going to be on the shelf a lot longer than those monthlies will be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's kind of a weird market because, if you don't sell enough issues, there might not be a trade. So, but because people want to buy it, but they want to buy it in the trade. But then if there is no trade,
yeah, and even when you're putting extras in the trades, right? So like, I want to make a really nice deluxe trade with all the character designs and all these essays and extra material. But the more fancy stuff you put in the trade, then the less incentive people have to buy the monthlies. So you're like, but I really would love for you to be a regular monthly reader. You know what I mean? Like that's. I mean, in an ideal world, you're both, right? You're double dipping.
Yeah, most people don't want to buy it twice, but...
Sure, and so I can't assume that I'm going to be able to get everyone double dipping. So I've got to sort of go, okay, what's the longevity of the format? And in that case, it's going to be the trade. So how do I make that the most viable sort of selling product? But make sure that the monthlies are at least beating a bare minimum so we can keep them going, because they act as both a loss leader and a bit of an advertisement. They're on the shelf every month and people see them, and it sort of worms its way into their head that this thing is still going and still valid.
What I've tended to do in some cases, well, like with Chew, for example, I started out, I'm buying digitally because I don't have any storage space here. But I was reading the trades because I started out kind of behind. And then when I got caught up to where the series actually was, then I found myself buying issues instead. Because
that's what's great about the digital, is that, you can ideally get that spontaneous kind of purchase that people will, oh yeah, I'll try that. Oh, there's another one. Oh, I'll try that. Oh, there's another one. And they just keep going. We've done digital sales where they've released the first few issues very, very cheap, like 99 cents or whatever. And what we find is that, we have a surge on those early issues, and then people stick around and they keep buying. Digital is so wonderful because there's no finite print run, and the store's always open. 24/7 international, and you're able to really take advantage of that spontaneity. I can tweet about the book and someone will be like, yeah, I'll try that, click, 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 and they've bought it. They don't have to track down a comic book store. They don't have to be open, and they don't have to have the book in stock.
Yeah. Okay. So, can you describe your typical work routine?
Oh man.
Or do you have a typical?
Not really. Not lately. It really depends on the month. So when I'm juggling this many projects, it's bonkers. It's like there's always a flow of emails coming in and things that need to be checked and approved, and books at different stages. Because on any particular series I'm working on, you're either you're sending issues to print, or you're checking the line art or the coloring or the lettering, or even further in advance, you're putting together what's called solicitation text for the catalog to describe to the retailer what the product is going to be, so they can get excited and hopefully order more of them. So you're thinking in like 6-month kind of sequences where you're like, okay, this current book I'm writing, while this other one a few months ahead, the line art's getting done. While that other one a month ahead, the coloring's getting done. While the other one that's going to press in 2 weeks, the lettering's getting finalized. And all of them are kind of happening simultaneously in slow motion. Mm-hmm. And that's one book. And then I'm doing 5 books. And so it's like, well, today's the day I'm going to spend the whole day doing proofing. And then tomorrow I've got to scramble because I need to get reference for this thing, or I'm working on this writing, or if it's the Marvel stuff, I'm getting approvals and I don't know when that approval is going to come through. Oh, the approval came through. Okay, I need to drop everything and go over and work on this. Or, oh, there's a problem, we need to fix it, or whatever else may be. So there's a sort of a controlled chaos to everything. Mm-hmm. Where as long as you're getting stuff done, it's all getting done. You know what I mean? Like, as long as I was productive today and I didn't screw anything up, then we're moving the ball forward. I don't know which ball, and sometimes it's different ones on different projects, but it's like there are things moving in a forward direction and we didn't screw it up. So today was a good day. Keep going.
Okay.
So it
make some progress on something.
Yeah, and and then you'll throw a convention trip in there, and it'll create just havoc, because you're like, well, now I'm doing this from my hotel, or now I've told everyone I'm going to be gone for a week, or whatever. Everything sort of you still got to deliver. I've written scripts on airplanes. I've written scripts in hotel rooms. I've done proofing on my phone while I'm sitting in a cafeteria in another city, like all sorts of weird. The digital working environment is wonderful in the sense that I can even do this at all, that I can get these correspondence anywhere, that I can work anywhere and be able to continue to do my job. Last summer, my wife and I, we actually did a big sabbatical. We went to Japan. We were in Tokyo for 6 weeks. Well, 4 weeks in Tokyo, and then 2 weeks on the road, like Kyoto and Osaka and all sorts of different places that we went. And I could just keep doing my job. Everything was 13 hours difference if I was trying to book a conference call, but otherwise, files got uploaded and things got sent and work got done and people got paid. So, as far as the clients were concerned, they were aware I was away, but with enough notice, there was no real big hiccup in terms of productivity.
I see. So when you were here for Kaigai, was that part of your 6 weeks?
No, actually, that was the Kaigai trip was I lucked out on. So we were here. That was 6 weeks. Was in May into June. And I hadn't been to Japan in about 5 years. And so that was like the first time I'd been since Wayward came out. And Steven and I got to do some signing events together and hang out and plan more Wayward stuff. And so I thought the summer was as good, just as good as it was going to get for the near future. And then the opportunity came up to go to Kaigai through a friend of mine who runs
the TCAF stuff.
Yeah, the TCAF stuff. And so they were able to pull together a ticket for me, and they offered for me to go. And I jumped at the chance because I was already missing it like crazy because, it was weird because I hadn't gone to Japan, in 5 years, and then all of a sudden twice in 1 year. And it was like, it didn't feel like it was enough. Like I felt like I was so awash in all of it in a good way. It was wonderful.
I see. Were you coming back?
Well, that's the thing, right? So, my wife and I were joking about that. A couple nights ago, we were booking convention travel for a bunch of different shows. So we were booking our flights for like the Calgary Comic Expo, and there's a show in Washington D.C. that we're doing, and there's a show in Orlando, Florida that we're doing, and so we're booking all this travel. And the good thing is that sometimes the show is reimbursing me for flights, but I get the points, and so all my points I've stocked up, and I'm like, I wonder if I got enough for a flight to Japan. We checked, and it's a little short. So maybe end of the summer I can start looking again and kind of going, I wonder if I could spring a flight on points and just pop over for a couple weeks. That would be wonderful, because the minute I leave, I always end up missing it terribly.
So you're going to a lot of conventions?
Yeah, I love it. It can, like I said, it can play havoc with my work schedule, but I'm pretty extroverted. So working from home and sort of alone in isolation can drive me a little stir crazy. And it's not that I forget what I'm doing, but it's that sense of like, it's nice to interact with other professionals and to sort of reinvigorate yourself and go, oh, this is why I do this, or these are the readers and people that are enjoying it, or these are my friends that are creating art that inspire me, and getting to see them, and it's a wonderful feeling. And so any convention season, I'll kind of burn myself out. I'll go to a ton of shows, and then by the end of by the fall, I'm sort of feeling burnt out, and I'm like, okay, I don't want to go anywhere anymore. But I'll be home for like 3 weeks, and then I'll go, oh, I miss people again. Kind of wish I was out there seeing folks. So, we're now just starting kind of the convention season. 2 weeks ago, we did Seattle, this show called Emerald City Comic Con. It's one of our favorites, and it's sort of the big kickoff to the season for us. And it's got me sort of in the groove right now of like, oh yeah, okay, there's a convention every 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm excited.
Yeah, great. I wish I were going to some of them myself. So what's the best advice you've ever heard given to a promising new creator?
One of the best things I've heard, and that I sincerely believe, is that you have to create stories that you, and this sounds so obvious, but hear me out, that you yourself would enjoy as a reader, that you're not trying to build something off of trends, that you're not trying to create something that you think someone else wants. It has to be something that comes from you, and that you would be the biggest fan of if someone else had created it. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that genuine quality that you bring into it, that feeling and that enthusiasm, if it's done well and it's done with quality, that's something that no one else can reproduce. Some of the biggest comic hits of the past 10 years, even 20 years, they're books that people have, if you pitched them cold, publishers would have said, well, there's nothing like that. I don't understand what to do with that or where to put that. And that's exactly why they worked, because they weren't like other stuff that was out in the market, because they weren't just trying to buck off a trend or copy what everyone else was doing. If you look at The Walking Dead, like, yes, there have been tons of zombie movies, but the particular way that they did it, and a black and white ongoing soap operatic horror comic in a market that doesn't sell horror and doesn't sell black and white. And it worked because it was genuine and heartfelt, and Kirkman, had something to say and an interesting take on the zombie genre. Scott Pilgrim's another really good example. Story that this weird video game romance, and it's like there was an audience out there that was like Mal, that was like Brian Lee O'Malley, that wanted to read about these kooky things or grew up with that music and those games. And he made a book that he always wanted to read, and realized that there was a huge audience of people that also would have wanted to read that, Yeah.
Chew is another example.
Yeah. And Chew was turned down by other publishers because they couldn't wrap their heads around it, because they thought it was too weird, and who's going to read this strange, bizarre humor, food, cannibalism comic? Like, what the hell is that? And yet, there was something genuine underneath, and there's something heartfelt there that came from John and Rob Guillory, and it's like, that's why it works. It works because the people involved are creating something that they are passionate about, and that passion and quality came through. It's not to say that every book will find huge success, but I feel like your best chance at success is creating something with that genuine approach, with that approach of, be damned the trends, or be damned what they'll tell you about a demographic, or but a bit of a cocky kind of build it and they will come attitude of, I'm going to make something that I fall in love with, as a creator, as a writer, as a person, So Skull Kickers, which was sort of my breakout book from Image in 2010, it's a sword and sorcery action comedy, and fantasy books don't sell. And no one does comedy because, but we found an audience for it and people really liked it. And it didn't sell chew numbers, but it still put me on the map. And we were putting out those issues consistently, and we had people responding to it because there wasn't stuff like that out in the market, and we were doing it with heart. And I feel like that is what stood out, and that's what continues to stand out. I'm thankful that I'm able to work on projects that I'm passionate about, that when I write Thunderbolts, I'm not just like, oh man, getting a Marvel paycheck could be great, but able to go, okay, I have something fun and something entertaining I want to bring to this. And if I can do that in a genuine way, then a readership will respond,
Yeah. Okay. So what's coming next from you? Uncanny Avengers, of course.
Yeah. So Uncanny Avengers, I pick up the series with issue 24, which ties into Marvel's big summer event, which is called Secret Empire. And so my first 2 issues tie in with the event. And then after that's over, we sort of break off and get to do our own stuff. But honestly, the tie-in issues, I'm having fun with them too, because they put the team in a really tough spot, which allows me to sort of show what they're made of. And so, like any dramatic device, if you can test your heroes and put them in the meat grinder, sort of show people what they've got underneath. And so it's been quite a bit of fun to do that. There's a lot of moving parts with any sort of major event where you've got practically the entire Marvel universe involved. Mm-hmm. But I'm learning a lot, and I'm having a blast doing it and getting to know these characters so that we can build even more exciting and fun things with them after the event wraps up as well. So yeah, Uncanny Avengers. I'm also writing one of the other sort of one-shot tie-in books for Secret Empire. It's just a one-off, like an annual size special called Secret Empire United, which is showing some of the sort of political backstabbing and stuff happening between a bunch of the villains. So you get to sort of see, you think that the bad guys, they pull off a really impressive maneuver at the start of the event, and you think that they've kind of got it all figured out. But then in my book, you sort of get a sense of the machinations and the egos and how screwed up they are, sort of operating underneath the surface. And so that's been a ton of fun as well, getting to write a bunch of characters I've never written before and, add something to the event, but also make it its own viable little story as well. And so those are the 2 things that have been announced. I got 2 other things that I'm working on that haven't been announced that I can't even talk about, which are Marvel related, which will be revealed later this summer. And I'm working on those in earnest as well. And in fact, after I get off the call with you, I'm digging in on one of those. So, okay. Mysteries.
Okay, and then you got conventions coming up?
Yeah. This weekend here in Toronto, there's a little show just called Toronto Comic-Con, which I haven't done in several years, but we had the new Wayward volume come out this month and the first volume of Glitter Bomb. So I thought, well, I want to get it out there and make sure that people get access to the book. So I'm going to be at Toronto Comic-Con this weekend. And then a few weeks after that is the Calgary Comic Expo. And then I'm doing a show in Washington, D.C., and I'm doing a show in Florida, and just, bouncing around quite a bit through the start of the summer.
Find Jim Zub at jimzub.com. You can write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look up Deconstructing Comics on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The latest episode is right behind this one in the podcast feed. This Thursday on To the Bat Poles, we reconsidered John Astin's turn as the Riddler. Look up To the Bat Poles wherever you find your podcast or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. Recently, I took a trip to Kyoto to visit the International Manga Museum. It's a reading library, but it also has exhibits about comics, galleries of original art, and an archive of very old comics dating back to the late 19th century. I made a recording there, but it's in Japanese. So what you'll hear next week is me discussing the museum with Graham McNee when I visited him in Kobe a couple of days later. I also made a stop at Nagoya to see Adam Passion of Big Ugly Robot Press. Some travel and comics history here next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.